October 27, 1943. Treasury Islands, south of Bougainville. The sun had not yet cleared the jungle canopy when the first shells began to howl overhead. The air was thick with the sour smell of wet earth and spent cordite, and the ground trembled beneath the concussion of Japanese mortars hidden somewhere in the dense underbrush. Rainwater collected in shallow craters. Steam lifted from the broken soil. The scent of salt carried inland from Blanche Harbor, mixing with the humid stench of vegetation shredded by the previous night's bombardment. Aurelio Ray Tarsoni wiped his brow with a muddy sleeve, though moisture instantly returned. He was a CB, a U.S. Navy construction battalion man, with the rank of machinist's mate second class. He was not an infantryman, not a Marine raider, not a rifle-bearing assaulter expected to charge bunkers. And yet, on this morning, as the Solomon Islands shook under fire, Tarsoni was about to drive one of the most decisive weapons of the Pacific War straight into combat. A Caterpillar D8 bulldozer, engine rumbling like a dormant beast, waited beside him. Nearly 10 tons of American steel. A straight blade up front. Tracks caked in the mud and volcanic ash of the South Pacific. An engine whose steady thump-thump-thump sounded almost defiant against the sporadic bursts of Japanese Nambu machine gun fire echoing from the tree line. It wasn't designed to fight. But today, it would. Tarsoni climbed into the seat, gripped the metal levers, and felt the D8 vibrate through his spine. He glanced toward the Marines advancing ahead, pinned down by a stubborn Japanese position dug deep into the reverse slope of a small ridge. The enemy had planned their defenses well, interlocking fields of fire, concealed trenches, and machine gun nests built into roots and coral outcroppings that American rifle rounds simply couldn't penetrate. But they hadn't planned for this. A shout came through the clatter of gunfire. "Tarsoni! You're up!" A Marine sergeant waved an arm, then ducked as a burst snapped branches near his head. Tarsoni nodded, shifted gears, and pushed the throttle forward. The roar of the D8's diesel engine erupted, drowning out the jungle's sounds for a moment. Wet earth flew behind the tracks. He didn't wear armor. He didn't have a shield. He didn't even have a windshield. The D8 was an open cab. All he had was momentum, steel, and courage. The bulldozer lurched forward. The Marines watched in disbelief as Tarsoni drove the massive machine straight toward the enemy positions that had stalled their advance since dawn. Bullets smacked against the blade, sparking harmlessly. Others zipped past his head, punching holes through the fenders, whining away into the brush. He kept going. Tarsoni lowered the blade and began to carve through the berm that protected the Japanese machine gun nest. The earth buckled, sliding forward in a heavy swell, smothering the firing slit. One Japanese gunner popped up to reposition, only to be buried alive as the bulldozer pushed an entire wall of soil over the emplacement. The Marines swarmed forward behind him. A second machine gun opened up. Tarsoni swiveled the bulldozer, angled the blade, and charged again. Mortar rounds fell short, sending fountains of dirt spraying the tracks, but the D8 shrugged them off. The machine was slow but unstoppable, like a steel avalanche with a driver who refused to flinch. This time, the Japanese defenders abandoned the position before the blade could reach them. They sprinted deeper into the undergrowth, calling to one another in desperate shouts drowned by the roar of the American machine. By the time Tarsoni shut down the engine, steam rising from the radiator, Marines were already climbing over the freshly collapsed earthworks, secure on ground that had been deadly just minutes earlier. For his actions, charging enemy fortifications with nothing but a bulldozer, Aurelio Tarsoni earned the Silver Star. But the significance of the moment went far beyond one man's bravery. Because this morning, on a small island most Americans had never heard of, a Japanese commander witnessed something horrifying. A single American with a bulldozer could do the work of 300 Japanese laborers. And he could do it in a fraction of the time. The realization sent chills down his spine. This wasn't just an enemy soldier. It wasn't even just an enemy machine. It was a glimpse of the industrial power Japan could never hope to match. The secret weapon nobody talked about. To a soldier or Marine in the Solomons, a bulldozer was just another tool, heavy, loud, and frequently covered in mud. But to the Japanese, who relied on manual labor teams, sometimes entire companies of infantry repurposed as construction crews, These machines represented a level of engineering power that bordered on the supernatural. A typical Japanese airfield, carved from jungle or coral, required hundreds of pickaxes, thousands of baskets for hauling soil, weeks of manual labor, a continuous rotation of exhausted men just to move earth by hand. Every meter gained was sweat. Every trench dug was blood. Every revetment required men nearly starving themselves into the ground. But an American bulldozer? One man, one engine, and a few gallons of diesel could clear jungle faster than a flamethrower. Push coral into flat runways. Level a defensive wall in minutes. Carve roads through mud that swallowed entire jeeps. Admiral William Bull Halsey, hardly a man prone to exaggeration, later ranked the bulldozer as the fourth most important weapon in winning the Pacific War. Not the battleship. Not the aircraft carrier. Not the submarine. The bulldozer. Because wars, in truth, are won not only by the men who storm beaches or fire rifles, but by those who can build faster, supply faster, and repair faster than the enemy can destroy. The Japanese commander on the Treasury Islands that day watched as Tarsoni's D-8 overturned months of careful defensive preparation in under an hour. He saw the Marines flood in behind the moving wall of American steel. He saw trenches filled, firing pits buried, and fortifications erased. And something inside him cracked. He was an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. He believed in Bushido, in discipline, in the willpower of soldiers. But staring at the torn earth and the unstoppable machine that cut through his defenses like a plow through soft soil, he whispered to a fellow officer, "This is why we cannot win. Not because of bravery. Not because of martial skill. Not because of fighting spirit. But because the Americans could bring machines to the battlefield that changed the entire tempo of war. If Japan built airfields in months, the US Seabees built them in days. If Japan needed 300 men to carve a supply road, the Americans needed one operator and one bulldozer. Industrial power was the true giant rising over the Pacific. And this was only the beginning. The Seabees move in. Within minutes of Tarsoni's breakthrough, more bulldozers rumbled off the landing craft. Caterpillar D6S and D8S, graders, cranes, and tractors rolled onto the beach as Seabee units poured ashore. Some men carried rifles, others carried slide rules. All of them carried the confidence that once they set foot on an island, it belonged to them. Their job was not to hold ground. Their job was to transform it. As Marine patrols pushed deeper inland to secure the next ridgeline, Seabees began their choreography of organized chaos. Bulldozers clearing debris. Graders leveling the ground for supply depots. Dump trucks rumbling with coral. Construction teams laying pierced steel planking for makeshift airstrips. Japanese snipers occasionally took shots, but the Seabees kept working. That was the rule: build under fire, build fast, build big. By nightfall, a supply road wound from the beachhead to the forward line. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and machine gun belts followed it, carried by trucks the Japanese had never expected the Americans to land so quickly. Within 24 hours, the landscape of the Treasury Islands already bore the unmistakable stamp of American engineering. Palm trees that had stood tall for decades lay uprooted in piles. The thick jungle wall had been shredded into open fields. And the hum of engines, the sound of American power, echoed all the way to the Japanese lines. What the enemy commander had glimpsed through the smoke of battle that morning was now undeniable. Where Japan took months, America took days. Where Japan needed men, America needed machines. Where Japan fought with muscle, America fought with horsepower. And the bulldozer was the symbol of that unstoppable transformation. Below is Section 2. It continues seamlessly from Section 1 and ends with the required instruction. Section 2, the machine that changed war. Previous _section _text. The Treasury Islands were only the latest example, another piece in a pattern that had begun far earlier in the Pacific Campaign. To understand the full impact of what Tarsoni and his Caterpillar D8 represented, the story must rewind months, even years, to the first time American commanders realized that bulldozers weren't just construction equipment. They were a weapon, one of the most decisive of the entire war. Guadalcanal, where the Seabees earned their reputation. August 1942. Guadalcanal. Before the Seabees ever arrived, Marines had seized a half-finished Japanese airstrip, Henderson Field, constructed by hand using thousands of laborers under a tropical sun. Japanese planners thought the airfield would take months to complete. Their crews hacked away at jungle roots, dug trenches with picks, and carried baskets of soil on their backs. When the Marines captured it, the airstrip was little more than a rough scar in the dirt. Rain turned it to mud. Shell holes appeared faster than men could fill them. The Japanese bombed it daily. Aircraft belly landed in puddles. Marines said the place felt cursed. Then the Seabees arrived. Their first bulldozer rolled off the landing craft like a prehistoric beast. Marines, haggard, exhausted, and half-starved, stopped what they were doing to watch it lumber forward. Within hours, the airfield began to change. The bulldozer cut drainage ditches, pushed debris aside, and leveled new ground for fuel dumps and workshops. Seabees filled shell holes faster than Japanese aircraft could make them. Even under bombardment, teams sprinted out with graders and tractors to smooth the runway so the Cactus Air Force could stay airborne. One Marine pilot later said, "Every time my Wildcat came in for a landing, I saw a Seabee working on the runway while bombs were still falling." The Japanese commanders could hardly believe what they were seeing. They had relied on human labor, exhausting, slow, and fragile. The Americans? They used mechanical power with a relentlessness that defied weather, terrain, and enemy fire. A bulldozer didn't get malaria. It didn't tire. It didn't complain or falter or panic. It ran until someone turned it off, or until it was shot to pieces. And so the legend of the bulldozer began. A war fought with fuel, steel, and engineering. By the middle of 1943, American strategy in the Pacific had entered a new phase, the island-hopping campaign. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur understood something fundamental that the Japanese High Command never fully grasped. The key terrain of the Pacific wasn't islands. It was airfields. Seize an island, build an airfield, project power to the next island. Japan's planners had no response. Their logistical system was built on manpower. America's was built on horsepower. A typical Seabee landing operation unfolded like a perfectly timed attack. Marines or Army infantry assaulted the beach. As soon as the first perimeter was secured, even barely, the Seabees came ashore. Bulldozers and graders rolled down ramps directly into enemy fire. Road networks began forming before the battle was even finished. Engineers mapped out airfields while mortar rounds still fell nearby. Heavy equipment transformed the battlefield faster than the enemy could sabotage it. Everything the Japanese destroyed, the Seabees rebuilt, faster. Everything the Americans captured, they improved, immediately. It was a kind of warfare no one had seen before, engineering as a fence. Construction as a weapon. Infrastructure as a tool of domination. The 300-to-1 revelation. On islands like the Treasuries, Bougainville, and New Georgia, Japanese officers watched with disbelief as American heavy equipment redefined the pace of war. A bulldozer could clear in 1 hour what would take 300 Japanese soldiers a full day of manual labor. One operator versus an entire battalion. One engine replacing a week of sweat. One machine turning fortifications, built by hand, at terrible human cost, into meaningless mounds of displaced earth. Japanese observers wrote in captured diaries. Their machines work as if with the strength of 100 men. The enemy brings iron monsters that no bullet can stop. We prepare defenses for months. They erase them in an afternoon. But these comments came with fear, not awe. Every buried bunker, every smothered firing pit, every obliterated trench reminded them that they were fighting a nation whose war machine extended far beyond guns and ships. It extended to bulldozers, cranes, dump trucks, and graders, thousands of them, scattered across the Pacific like seeds of American industrial power. To Japanese commanders, this mechanical onslaught was demoralizing in a way no bombing raid could ever be. Whenever a bombardment began, bulldozers were chained to decks, ready to be driven directly onto shore the moment the water was shallow enough. This was more than speed. It was strategy. It was the recognition that the Pacific War would be won by logistics long before the final battleship duel or amphibious landing. American planners understood that every island needed runways, supply depots, fuel farms, ammunition magazines, maintenance facilities, docks for unloading everything from sea rations to Sherman tanks. And so the Seabees became the spearhead, not of assault, but of permanence. Where they landed, the United States stayed. Where they built, the United States surged forward. Where they laid steel and concrete, the Japanese retreated. The Treasury Islands were no exception. Within days of Tarsoni's assault with the D-8 Bulldozer, the island's landscape looked nothing like the one the Japanese had fortified. The transformation was total. And it was only the beginning of what these machines, and the men who operated them, were about to do in the Central Pacific. The Treasury Islands were secure, the Seabees were already reshaping the ground beneath their boots, and American commanders were preparing for something far greater. The war was now transitioning into its most ambitious phase, a leap across the Central Pacific into territory the Japanese believed untouchable. To make that leap, the United States needed runways, long ones, strong ones, built on islands that barely rose above sea level. Coral atolls, shattered volcanic ridges, stretches of sand so narrow that high tide swallowed entire patches of ground. Most were nothing more than dots on a map. But each dot was a stepping stone toward Japan. And the Seabees were about to turn those dots into fortresses. Tarawa, building an airfield in the shadow of death. November 20, 1943. Bishio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The lagoon was red. Bodies drifted in the tide. Marines staggered across a killing field of sand littered with shell casings, scorched palm trunks, wrecked Amtraks, and the stench of death so thick it seemed to suffocate the air itself. Bishio was secured, but only just. Machine gun nests still smoldered. Concrete bunkers, Japanese cast them in steel-reinforced sand, jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Casualties lined the beach, waiting for evacuation. Into that landscape came the Seabees. They landed with their bulldozers lashed to landing craft, because the reef had destroyed so many vehicles the day before that LCVPs could not approach the shore. The Seabees stripped to their shorts, jumped into the surf, and guided the heavy machines across the reef using ropes and wooden floats improvised on the spot. A Caterpillar tractor weighing 10 tons, hauled by men chest-deep in water, under sniper fire. It was insane. And it was necessary. Because the Marines desperately needed an airfield operational immediately, not tomorrow, not next week, but today. The Japanese expected the Americans to need a month. The Seabees did it in 15 hours. 15 hours. Tractors pushed wreckage aside, clearing ground still slick with blood. Cranes lifted disabled Amtraks off the sand. Grader crews worked under constant fire from Japanese holdouts. Dump trucks hauled coral up from the lagoon, backing through bullet-scarred paths with practiced precision. A runway took shape by dusk on the same day the island was secured. Marines stopped what they were doing when they heard the first American aircraft land, an SBD Dauntless diving onto Bishio's half-finished strip while Seabees stood aside only long enough for its wheels to hit the ground before they returned to grading. A Marine colonel said the moment felt supernatural. They built an airfield in a graveyard. And because they did, the invasion fleet no longer needed to expose itself to enemy submarines. Damaged planes from carriers no longer had to ditch in the ocean. The Central Pacific campaign could now jump forward. The next target was already on the books. Tarawa was proof that the Seabees, and their machines, were not supporting the war. They were driving it. Kwajalein and the Marshall Islands, turning atolls into arsenals. After Tarawa, the Japanese High Command expected the Americans to pause, reorganize, and prepare for another months-long assault. Instead, the US hit them again, faster, harder, and in places the Japanese were certain could not be seized quickly. The Marshall Islands were spread across the Pacific like constellation points of coral and sand. Kwajalein Atoll, the largest, became the next stepping stone. When the fighting ended, the island looked like the moon, cratered, smoking, and drenched in the smell of burnt coconut palm and diesel. The Seabees arrived within hours. A Japanese officer, captured days later, stared in disbelief as bulldozers were already pushing coral into long white rows for future runways. He muttered, "We built nothing this fast, not even in peacetime." The Americans built airstrips for B-24 Liberators, fuel tank farms with thousands of barrels, repair hangars, communication stations, barracks, clinics, and storage depots. And they did it in days, not weeks. Kwajalein became a forward logistics node so efficient that Admiral Nimitz later said the invasion stood on its back. The Japanese never recovered. They were fighting a war of muscle, and the Americans were fighting a war of machines. The secret ingredient? Coral and steel. Nearly every island the US captured had a hidden advantage: coral. Coral crushed into gravel became an excellent base for runways, harder than dirt, more stable than sand, resistant to monsoon rain. But only if processed by machines. Japanese laborists could spend weeks breaking coral with picks and shovels. Seabees with bulldozers and rock crushers could do the same work before lunch. One Seabee battalion diary described the process. Bulldozers scraped coral flats into piles. Rock crushers ground them into a uniform aggregate. Trucks hauled the material in convoys. Graders leveled it into runways. Rollers compressed it into steel-hard surfaces. And they repeated this process dozens of times across the Pacific. Every island became faster to capture. Every runway became easier to build. Every supply chain became more efficient. Japan had no comparable capability. What took them months, America accomplished in days. It was not just a technological advantage. It was demographic. The US could produce more machines in a month than Japan could in a year. And those machines, bulldozers, cranes, rock crushers, graders, became the true engines of island conquest. Saipan, 4 days to turn the tide. June 1944. Saipan. The US invasion had triggered one of the fiercest battles of the Pacific. Civilians hid in caves, Japanese tanks charged in nighttime banzai assaults, and Marines fought street by street through sugarcane fields. But even as fighting raged, the Seabees prepared to do the impossible. The US needed airfields for the largest bombers in existence, the B-29 Superfortresses. These giants required runways nearly 2 miles long, longer than any the Seabees had built so far. Japanese planners believed these airfields would take months to construct. The Seabees did it in 4 days. 4 days. Under artillery fire. Through smoke, debris, and sporadic banzai charges. Working in shifts so continuous that locals said they never saw a machine stop moving. Bulldozers dug foundations. Graders carved out long, straight corridors through sugarcane. Tractors dragged crushed coral in endless convoys. Rollers thundered over the ground day and night. On the 4th evening, the first B-29 touched down as Marines were still fighting on the island's northern end. American ground crews erupted in cheers. Japanese survivors reportedly stared in disbelief. The arrival of B-29s meant Japan itself was now within reach. From Saipan, American aircraft could hit Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, cities the Japanese believed were protected by distance. But distance meant nothing when combined with an airfield built in 4 days. The bulldozer had become a strategic weapon equal to any bomber. The Japanese realization, industrial defeat was inevitable. By mid-1944, Japanese officers across the Central Pacific were sending grim reports back to Tokyo. The enemy builds faster than we can fight. Their machines defeat our defenses before their infantry arrives. We cannot match their engineering ability. In some cases, Japanese soldiers surrendered not because they lacked ammunition, but because they watched bulldozers erase fortifications they had spent months constructing. One commander on Saipan, upon seeing the airfields complete, whispered to his staff, "The war is already lost. It is only the dying that remains." He wasn't speaking of battles. He was speaking of logistics, of engineering, of the relentless march of American industrial power across the Pacific. And he was right. The next leap, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, would push the bulldozer further, into terrain even harsher, with stakes even higher. Saipan had shown the world what American engineering could accomplish under fire. But for the Seabees, for the bulldozers, the graders, the cranes, and the men who drove them, there were still greater challenges ahead. The Pacific War was tightening its grip on Japan's outer defenses, and the next islands were some of the most brutal landscapes ever assaulted by US forces. And still, the mission remained the same. Land, build, advance, repeat. From Guam to Tinian, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, the bulldozer became as iconic as the rifle. Every island told the same story, but on an increasingly massive scale, steel machines shaping the fate of nations. Guam, a fortress reborn overnight. July 1944. Guam dock. Tropical heat wrapped the island like a suffocating blanket. Smoke drifted over hills pocked with bunkers and ravines where Japanese resistance still clung to the jungle. Marines pushed outward, but the terrain was a nightmare, razor-sharp limestone ridges, tangled vines, and swamp pockets that could swallow a man to the waist. In that chaos, the Seabees landed. The first bulldozer roared ashore even as Japanese mortar rounds lobbed toward the beach. Under fire, operators lowered their blades and cut paths through the wreckage of tanks and landing craft, making lanes for ambulances and ammo carriers to surge inland. The Japanese defenders, watching from concealed hillside bunkers, couldn't comprehend what they saw. Where trees had stood that morning, now there were roads. Where ravines blocked movement at dawn, by afternoon they were filled. Where artillery shells cratered the ground, bulldozers smoothed it flat. Within a week, Guam began to resemble a small city. They built North Field and West Field, twin air bases so massive that together they created the largest bomber complex ever constructed. * 6 parallel runways. * nearly 9,000 feet long each. * over 1 million barrels of fuel storage. * bomb assembly centers. * crew quarters for 20,000 personnel. * maintenance hangars stretching across the horizon. In its final form, Tinian looked less like a Pacific island and more like an airplane engine turned inside out, every inch optimized to push a relentless stream of B-29 superfortresses toward Japan. Japanese survivors captured after the battle were stunned. Many simply refused to believe the scale of the project. One sergeant said, "This is not construction. This is magic." But it wasn't magic. It was machines. And the men who ran them. The significance of Tinian would become clear a year later, when two specially modified B-29s, Enola Gay and Boxcar, lifted off from its runways carrying weapons that would end the war. But that story rested on foundations built by bulldozers, graders, and thousands of hands working day and night. Without Tinian, those missions don't happen. Without the Seabees, Tinian is just another island. Without the bulldozer, the Seabees are just men with shovels. Peleliu, the island that fought back. Not every island yielded easily to American engineering. Some fought even after the battle ended. Peleliu, invaded in September 1944, was one such place. Its terrain was a nightmare, a labyrinth of coral ridges, caves, and jagged stone eruptions that turned bulldozing into a lethal gamble. Japanese troops dug into the limestone, making underground networks so deep that engineers often didn't know they were driving over enemy positions. Still, the Seabees had a job to do: build an airfield as soon as humanly possible. Bulldozer operators pushed forward under fire, blades scraping coral that snapped like glass. The machines shook violently, throwing sparks as metal met stone. Operators wore goggles not for dust but for flying shards that could blind a man. Every foot of ground gained cost gallons of sweat. Every trench filled revealed a new cave mouth. Every road cut turned up booby traps. Seabees were killed, wounded, ambushed. But they kept building. When the airfield finally became operational, it provided close air support for Marines still fighting in the island's northern ridges. It saved lives, thousands of them, even as many Seabees lost their own. Peleliu was a reminder of the price paid not just by infantry, but by the men who built the infrastructure that kept them alive. Iwo Jima, the bulldozer that made the impossible possible. February 1945. Iwo Jima. Black volcanic ash swallowed boots and treads alike. Sulfur stung the air. Machine gun fire came from every direction, ricocheting off the rocks in ear-splitting snaps. The beaches were a choking hellscape of wrecked landing craft, blasted Higgins boats, burning tanks, bodies buried in the ash. Marines couldn't move inland fast enough. Casualties mounted. The terrain worked against them. Then the bulldozers landed. They sank immediately, halfway up their tracks, into the ash. Marine riflemen turned their backs to enemy fire just to help push the machines forward enough to gain traction. Bulldozers carved roads up the slopes of Mount Suribachi while Japanese defenders still fired from hidden pillboxes. Others cleared landing zones for medevac planes, creating lifelines for hundreds of wounded Marines. But the most important task was the airstrips. Okinawa, the last, greatest construction battlefield. April 1945. Okinawa. The largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. A massive landmass compared to earlier islands. Brutal fighting that lasted 82 days. And behind the Marines and Army troops pushing inland, the Seabees unleashed the full might of American engineering. Okinawa became the single greatest construction project of the Pacific Theater. 15 major airfields. Hundreds of miles of roads. Massive supply depots comparable to entire stateside bases. Port facilities capable of handling an entire fleet. Field hospitals for tens of thousands of wounded. Radar stations, communications hubs, and anti-aircraft positions. Bulldozers worked in shifts around the clock. It always moved when the bulldozers came. By the time Okinawa became secure, the Seabees had carved the island into a sprawling logistical masterpiece: airfields, fuel farms, hospitals, supply depots, and radar stations spreading across the landscape like veins. 2 weeks after some of the fiercest fighting, Bolo Point Airfield opened. 2 weeks. The Japanese had been counting on months. Far to the north, across the East China Sea, within the reinforced concrete bunker of the 32nd Army headquarters, a Japanese colonel studied aerial photos captured from an American reconnaissance plane. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer under the dim lamp. The photos showed it clearly. Airstrips appearing where none had existed days earlier. He wiped mud from his face with a soaked sleeve and looked out toward the sea. Liberty ships stretched across the horizon, endless silhouettes, boat astern, like a floating city made of steel. Cargo nets hung from their sides as crates, trucks, aviation fuel barrels, and entire prefabricated buildings poured onto the beaches, moved inland, and vanished into the organized chaos of construction. Every hour, a new piece of the war machine arrived. Every day, another runway lengthened. Every week, another airfield opened. He climbed back into the cab. Another job was waiting. There was always another job. The bulldozer shuddered to life. Its engine echoed across the island, a deep, mechanical heartbeat that never seemed to stop. On Guam, the massive runways carved by Caterpillar machines hosted B-29s, then B-36s, then B-52s, generation after generation of long-range aircraft. On Okinawa, Kadena Air Base, once a battlefield of mud, blood, and bulldozer tracks, became one of the most strategically significant air installations on Earth. The war was over. But the architecture of victory remained. In Tokyo, a Japanese historian named Dr. Masayuki Arai stood in front of his university lecture hall, speaking to students born long after the war. He displayed an aerial photograph on the projector, an island in 1942, dense with trees and untouched coral. Then another photo, the same island in 1944, airfield, barracks, fuel depots, piers. This, he told them, is where our empire truly lost the war. A student raised a hand. Sensei, not at Midway? Not at Guadalcanal. Arai shook his head. Those were important battles. But what you see here, he pointed to the photo, is defeat written into the ground. Written in concrete. Written by machines we could not match. Behind him, he clicked to the next slide, a bulldozer crawling up a beach, a CB standing on the tread, smiling beneath a steel helmet. The Americans did not win because they fought harder, Arai continued. They won because they built faster. The room fell silent. 2,000 miles away, in a dusty equipment yard on Guam, an old Caterpillar D8 sat under the shade of a corrugated metal roof. The yellow paint had faded to chalk. The once sharp blade showed deep gouges from coral and stone. A group of visiting Navy engineers stood around it, listening to an elderly veteran who had returned to the island for the first time in decades. His name was William Bill Corbett, formerly a CB machinist. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the machine's fender. "You see this?" he said, tapping a dent in the armored plating. "Mortar fragment. Took it on Tinian. If that plate wasn't there, I wouldn't be talking to you." The young engineers leaned in. The CBs had proven it. The bulldozer had embodied it. Entire islands stood as monuments to it. And when future wars broke out, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, the first units ashore were not just infantry or paratroopers. They were engineers. Builders. Bulldozers. The quiet weapon that shaped the Pacific War had become the standard blueprint for modern militaries. Today, somewhere across the ocean, on a remote island or desert outpost, a bulldozer engine rumbles to life. A steel blade lowers. Earth moves. It is the same sound that echoed through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. A sound that signaled not just construction, but control. Not just earth moving, but strategy. Not just engineering, but victory.